welcome to another Grieving Hearts seminar this evening. I'll just ask before we begin that you please silence or put any of your cell phones on vibrate just to avoid any distractions during Christine's presentation. Tonight we'll be talking about grief during the holidays, and there'll be a small period at the end of the seminar for any questions if you have or any comments you'd like to make or share a story. I'll pass it over to Christine McMillan, who will be leading us this evening.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you to Families First for continuing to offer these amazing presentations to the community. But most of all, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank all of you for choosing to spend the evening here, because you're telling me that you're willing to engage with your grief at a most difficult time of the year. So I want to give you a shout out. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to be here about an hour and a half, depending on how chatty you are. We've got a wonderfully big group here, and those joining us from home or wherever they are. I will definitely make space at the end of the evening for comments, but I'll also ask you during the evening if you have any questions, any comments, anything you want me to repeat. This isn't a support group format, as you can appreciate. It's more me talking, but you can certainly ask anything that relates to you, but we can't obviously spend too much time because this is a more general overview. I'm not going to be able to speak to your particular grief experience. So having said that, I will ask you sometime during the evening if you want to take a break. If at any point in time you need to get up, stretch your legs, get a breath of fresh air, please, I need you to look after your needs. I need you to put yourself first, because this is your evening. This is part of your grief work. So before we begin, I just want you to kind of settle into your chairs. I want you to kind of put your feet on the ground. I want you to ground yourself, and I want you to take some deep breaths. Some deep breaths, and with every exhale, just kind of release any kind of tension or apprehension that you may be holding. And I want you to make a commitment that you are not going to judge yourself tonight for how you're feeling. Maybe if your eyes speak your grief by way of tears, please don't judge yourself. Please allow you to feel whatever you're feeling, because this is going to be the message, one of the messages that I'd like to impart with you tonight. Okay? So grief in the holidays. From a very young age, we're imprinted in our psyche what the holiday should look like, what the season should look like. When we get together with family and with dear friends, the people that kind of give our life meaning, and they bring joy into our lives. But if you're new to grief, how can you even imagine experiencing joy if there's somebody very important that's absent? You may be dreading it. You may be telling yourself a story. It's going to be horrible. I'm not going to be able to manage it. So no wonder you're dreading it. You may want to skip it. You may hope that it doesn't even come. But one of the things about mental health, but good mental health, is about bravely and courageously working towards accepting our new reality, however painful it is. That's good mental health. Good mental health isn't necessarily the diagnosis of an illness. Good mental health is coming to terms and living with our reality. So, what if I asked you to consider tonight another story? So some of the things you may be thinking, the story you're telling yourself over and over again, why you're dreading the upcoming holiday season, because there's going to be pain. Yes, there's going to be pain. I'll acknowledge that. But what if I offered you another alternative? And gratitude was that door you needed to go through. that you cultivate gratitude and you hold your pain at the same time. Because ignoring the pain doesn't make it go away. And I'm not up here to tell you it's going to be pain-free. Dr. Alan Wolfelt calls this kind of pain that you're feeling here, we're feeling collectively in the room, as clean pain. And clean pain is what he refers to as earned pain. Do you know what that means? You've earned this pain. Their absence means something. Their presence meant something to you. And so the pain you're feeling is earned. So come along with me and we'll talk about how do we create some space for your pain. It might seem counterintuitive, but we're not going to deny that there's going to be some element of pain. So you are all here because you're not only grieving, but you're actually bereaved. And bereaved is a separation as a result of death. So while we grieve all different types of losses, you were also bereaved. And bereavement is considered one of the highest on the stress scale. It is one of the most difficult experiences we have in life. And it triggers an instinctive response. Sometimes we have no control of it. And when you're bereaved, you're not only torn apart, you not only feel wronged, but you have special needs that you have to pay attention to. Sadness and grief deplete us of our inner resources. Physically, we are exhausted. Mentally, we are distracted. And emotionally, we live on the edge, fearing a loss of composure when we are with friends and family. Anyone feel that at all? That's an adequate summary of it, but that's not all. But it can also be unpredictable, disruptive, and overwhelming. So grief is in control. However, it is also a normal and natural process. So everything that you're experiencing, with the exception of thinking about causing yourself harm or anyone else, is normal. You're not going to live in this state forever. If you do what I'm going to talk about very soon. But if you're new, if you're fresh to the grief experience, this is how it affects you. It's overwhelming, unpredictable, messy. It's trying to get your attention. But it's also normal and natural. You're all here because of one really important concept, and that is attachment. You had the capacity to attach. You didn't have a business relationship. You didn't have a mind-to-mind relationship. You had a heart-to-heart relationship. And so when we're separated from that person who brought meaning and structure into our lives, we're going to have that instinctive response. It's biologically based. It's a primitive experience. So maybe when we talk about the grief response, what we're really saying is, we didn't get to finish the story on our terms. Maybe your loved one died after a long, slow illness. Maybe it was quick, maybe it was sudden, maybe it was unexpected, maybe it was complicated, the relationship. But what we do know is that we weren't ready to finish the story. Even when you hear things like they had a long, good life, right? You would have liked one more day. It wouldn't have been enough. So this is our response to an unfinished story. And Eric Fromm says, to spare oneself from grief at all cost can be achieved only at the price of total detachment, which excludes the ability to experience happiness. So can you imagine not loving and attaching? Be easy, you wouldn't be here tonight. But you wouldn't have the memories, you wouldn't have the experiences, you wouldn't be the person you are today, you wouldn't have the joy. And when we shut down sad and painful experiences as a matter of default, we run the risk then of also shutting down joy and happiness and pleasure. Because our brains will just become accustomed to not feeling in order to protect us. So we say grief is the cost of love. It's a high cost, but would you trade in the time you had with your loved one? John Bramlett wrote in Learning to Live Again After the Loss of a Child, he wrote, if only I could hold you one more time, if only once more on my lap you would climb, I'd feel the warmth of life now gone and the weight of your tiny body close to mine. I'd look into the depths of your sky blue eyes to your very soul. And in those depths our soul would join. I would hold you like that forever, content to never move again. I would choose to let the world pass by while we sat there in stillness for all the time that is to come. The two of us together in the simple contentment of just being, sharing the elusive gift we know as life. Can you just feel that connection there? That connection between a parent and a child. And can you also feel the depth of his grief? Also feel the depth of his grief. John Bramlett was undergoing cancer treatment when his 2-year-old son was hit by a truck right outside their home. So here are some things to know about grief. Discard the notion of stages. Who still believes in stages here? No one's going to put up their hand. Oh, I know. No one's going to put up their hand. It doesn't happen in stages. That 5-stage model, or some say 6-stage model, was adopted because bereavement and grief didn't have a model back then, a framework. But we do have lots of frameworks now. And we know it's not clean and orderly. It's not linear. But it really is very tempting to want to believe that because, right, if I'm at bargaining, then I'm closer to acceptance. Makes sense, right? But grief is very dynamic. It's more wave-like. It comes in bursts. It gets your attention sometimes when you least expect it. And at the beginning of the process, those waves are fast and furious. It's like everywhere you look, you're looking through the lens of grief. And those waves are big and sometimes they pull you under. Your job is to stay your course. Your job is to get a footing. Let grief have its way at the beginning in order for you to conquer it and embrace it later. Because you'll always be dancing with your grief. There is no closure. That's another presentation. There's no closure. There is reconciliation. There is learning to live with it. Because if you had closure, then we'd stop loving. And another myth is that it gets better with time. Well, it kind of peaks weeks and months later. Because what happens is the shock and the numbness start to wear off. And because we don't do grief very well in this society, because we don't talk about it, because we're not honest about it, because we use humor to deflect this awkwardness about grief. We think we should be getting better, because everyone tells us we should be getting better. And so we have internalized those messages. So then what's wrong with me? There's something wrong with me. I'm not coping with it. But it does feel worse. It can feel worse. So I don't want you to beat yourself up if there's time and space between you and your loved one's death, and it's feeling a little bit more difficult. It will also peak at this time of year as well. Don't be surprised if you do have moments where your grief isn't as heavy, where you find yourself laughing and enjoying and being in the moment. And it's okay if you feel a little guilty after that too. That's the nature of grief. It's kind of cunning, it's sneaky. You don't feel like yourself for now. So grief is trying to get your attention with all of this stuff. So my direction to you, my suggestion to you, is to stop every now and then and pay attention to it. Please don't ignore your grief. Any questions so far? Any comments? No? Anyone gonna break the ice? Yes, sir.
Is broken heart syndrome like a real thing? Or is
It is, and I'll get to that on the next slide.
Okay.
It is. There is a medically based. Yep, that's a great question.
Thank you.
So how does grief affect you? Right? We had a slide at the very beginning that gave kind of an adequate overview of what grief does. But let's look a little deeper into how it affects you. So it's not neat and tidy. So when we think about grief, we usually think about our emotions, right? Sadness, anger, bitterness, relief, guilt, anxiety. I'm not suggesting you have to feel any of that, but if you have experienced it, it's okay, it's normal. But when we're a little bit emotionally what we call dysregulated, we're not quite ourselves, we get scrambled brain, we get grief brain. It takes our thinking brain offline. Yeah. It's more the fight or flight response. And when we're in our fight or flight response, we're not thinking what we're going to do, we just do it. That's why we suggest not making any major decisions. So it scrambles our brain by affecting our concentration, our focus, our memory retention. Anybody experience that? Yeah? Yeah, anybody was scared about that? Yeah. But what about some of you, because I know some of you have had some grief experiences that were a little longer. Those come back, don't they? Your memory comes back. It comes back online. Once you let grief do what it needs to do, you manage what you need to manage, you regain those things. But it does scramble the brain. We don't have enough bandwidth to make decisions, to focus, to concentrate. Those things aren't as important. Because we're focused on our grief. Grief is also stress, and that goes back to your comment, sir. And stress affects the body. We know that. It can affect our sleep, our eating patterns. We can experience heart palpitations, shortness of breath, irritable bowel, tension. Where do you hold your stress? Difficulty breathing, right? Taking a deep breath, restlessness. And when we don't find ways to work our grief out, because it is energy that sometimes needs to be worked out, even though it can be also extremely fatiguing, those stress hormones stay in us and can lead, if you're susceptible, to heart issues. So there is actually a broken heart syndrome. Now, I don't want to put fear into all of you, but we all know the importance of exercise and movement and good diet. That's even more important during grief, because grief is stress. And while grief can slow you down and fatigue you, it can also be nervous energy, which has to be released. So some sort of movement, some sort of activity is very important. I hope that answers your question. Okay. So, emotionally, our mind it affects our bodies. It also affects how we deal with other people and how we interact with other people. We can become extremely clingy, or we may fear being alone. And really, there's nothing rational about it. Remember, because it's feelings. We're not thinking. We may not think jokes are funny any longer. We may not like to be in large crowds, in social situations. We may become upset at people where we had certain expectations that they would support us, and they're not able to do it. And it can feel like another loss on top of the loss of your loved one. So grief isn't nice and neat and orderly. This is a pretty picture. But it's really quite, it's jagged, it's sharp. And lastly, it could affect what we call on a spiritual level. And I'm not talking about religious beliefs necessarily, but I'm talking about why, the why questions. Why me? Why us? Why him or her? You may start questioning your worldview. That if you do good things are going to happen to you. What about all the bad people that are still walking this earth? You know how many times I hear, they were a good person. She didn't deserve to die. So that, to me, speaks to the person's worldview. What do you think is fair? So that's how it affects us on 5 realms. And sometimes you think you've got it for the moment, and then it can knock your feet out from under you. And it doesn't have anything to do with you as an individual, a capable individual. This is bigger than us. And so what we have to do is we have to surrender to it. We have to trust the process. Any questions about this? Many times I'll hear from my clients, do I have to feel angry? I'm not angry at anyone. And you don't have to feel or experience anything that's up there. But I can assure you, you will have experienced some of these in some degree for some length of time. Yes?
So everything that you're describing here, I've been feeling lately, but it's hard to connect it. Like in my brain, I can't connect it to the loss that I experienced 2 weeks ago. Is that normal? Like in my head, I'm depressed, but it sounds like grief, and it makes sense for it to be grief, but in my brain and my heart, I can't put the two together.
You can't understand how. Can you give me an example?
Past 2 days, I spent the whole time in bed, not eating, migraines since the funeral. It's just, I'm a mess.
What's your name?
Carly.
Carly, that's grief. That's grief. It's grief. It's like you've been run over by a Mack truck. it does slow us down so that we can start absorbing this. And you are so, so new to this process. Who died?
My nephew.
Oh, okay. So our heads know, our hearts don't know. Our hearts are leading this process right now. I would suspect, without knowing anything more, that everything you're experiencing these last 2 weeks is grief related. I think you can pretty well guarantee it would be grief related. Especially when that's not your normal. It's not your normal to stay in bed. So grief is responsible. Grief is telling you to slow down. Okay? Yes, sir.
So, about 7 months ago, I lost my daughter. And despite that list, I haven't felt anything other than anger, emotionless. It's almost like every emotion you can possibly feel is just not there. So, it was a hard loss. I haven't cried, I don't know what it is. Losing her was tough because she was only 7.
What was her name?
Naya.
Naya?
So I just wonder why that is. Is that normal? Because it doesn't sound normal to me. No crying, no anxiety. I mean anger, but a lot of these I haven't done.
So it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to feel any of these soon after.
7 months ago.
It's okay. That's your way of protecting yourself. Our brains are wonderful. It will do whatever it needs to do to protect us. But it can also convince us, if I keep busy, then I'm okay. So we've got to really watch the death of a young child is overwhelming. You're just functioning right now.
I've been good at it because
You've been good at it.
I've spent my life in survival mode, and now I'm in a place where I don't have to be that way anymore. But my brain is still on that.
That's a very, very interesting comment because that's your default, survival. That's your default. But anger is grief. Anger is part of grief. I have no doubt that you miss her, but I don't have to necessarily see it in tears. But I need to see it somehow.
Because a lot of my emotions aren't even outward. They're just inward.
Well, and that's the thing, you have to find, and we'll get to that. We have to find some way to what we call externalize it, release it outside so we don't carry it inside of us. Thank you. Grief is a demanding companion. In those early days and weeks and months, it was always there. Not just below the surface, but on the surface, simmering, lingering, festering. Then, like a wave, it would rise up and pulse through me as if it was going to tear my heart right out of my body. In those moments, I felt like I couldn't bear the pain for one more minute, much less one more hour. That's from option B, Sheryl Sandberg's book. She was formerly the CEO of Facebook, and Dave, her husband, died as a result of a heart attack at 48. So grief doesn't pay attention to our postal code or our income statement or our religious belief. It's an equal opportunity visitor. It doesn't matter who you are. Sometimes I dial his number and then I remember, I can't believe he's gone. That's not the head. That's the heart for remembering. He's not here. So, because grief is a normal, natural process after we've attached and we've lost access to that loved one, to our person, nature has also provided us with a way to process this, and that's called mourning. So what that means, grief happens to you. Those 5 things, they just happen to you. But mourning is what you do with your grief in order to get through it. It's action. This is called your grief work. It's accessing your thoughts and feelings and releasing them outside of you. The problem, though, is we live in a society that's a mourning avoiding culture. We have lots of invitations to carry your grief. And what we mean by that is, men don't cry, go back to work, you'll feel better. They wouldn't want you to feel like this. They lived a good life. At least she's not in pain anymore. And so what do? You keep it inside, you buck up. Those are buck up messages. Dr. Alan Wilfeld calls those buck up messages. Pull up your socks. Right? We say things like, well, you've got closure now. The funeral's over. Well, I'm here to tell you that it's just beginning. The process is just beginning. So we live in a mourning avoiding culture that tells us to hurry up and get well. You don't want to be a Debbie Downer. I'm sorry if there's any Debbies in the room. I don't want to make other people sad. Or, I don't want to bring up your loved one's name because I don't want to make you feel sad. Well, don't I think that you're already thinking about it? So we hide it away. We hurry it up. We don't honor it. So I don't make criers out of non-criers. I'm not going to make somebody who doesn't like writing, I'm not going to insist that they journal and that they write letters. But you have to find some way to access those feelings and find a way to release them. Whatever is compatible with your personality. I've had clients who have painted and brought in pictures of their painting as an expression of their grief. I've had clients who have written poetry about their loved ones, and we've discussed the poetry. They're not criers. They weren't criers. They weren't even necessarily talkers. But that's how they expressed it. Any questions about the difference between grieving and mourning? Anything you want me to go over, clarify? So grief is what happens. Mourning is what you do to get through the process. But because we live in a mourning avoiding society, we do things like avoiding, numbing, engaging in distracting behaviors. Returning back to work too soon. Selling the house. Releasing their possessions because they're too painful. Taking down the pictures. Redecorating. Keeping busy. Routines are good, structure is good, but when you're doing that to avoid, and I'm always asked, how do I know if what I'm doing is mourning avoiding or healthy? If you're doing something with a sense of urgency, you're running away. If you feel a sense of anxiety that you've got to do it, you've got to do it. You're trying to avoid the pain, the work of processing the pain. Otherwise, you're doing it then to move through it, not to rush away from it. Because grief will always find you. We don't want to carry our grief. Not when it's this big. We want to work with it so that it softens and it's manageable. So what you need to do is you need to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. You need to honor the process. Because when we do our mourning, it leads to a form of grief that's more permanent, and it's a grief we can live with. We're not always trying to outrun it. We're not always looking for those triggers. We're not always sidestepping those triggers. We can talk about our loved ones, and it doesn't get caught here in our throat. I had a client many years ago whose 13-year-old daughter died suddenly. And she did her mourning, but in retrospect, she said years later that she wished she had slowed down a little more because she saw that as precious time with her daughter. Very, very sacred and private time between her and her daughter. And no two people are going to grieve alike, and no two people are going to mourn the same way, even if they're grieving the same person. So I thought that was a really interesting comment. She saw that as very sacred. Not that she didn't also continue with daily life, but she saw that as a very special time. But it is a state of suspension that we don't like living in, between what was and what's yet to be. We don't like that state of suspension, right? We have calendars and more appointments and plans for next year. But grief is taking us in another direction, and we have to kind of follow grief. And we don't like that state of suspension. But trust me that you can get through it, and you can get on top of the grief. So it doesn't matter. You can try to hold it in, but it'll come out somehow. When I see someone early in the process, and it could be up to a year, depending on how the person died, circumstances of the death, I would still consider that early in the process. Because we do have built-in defense mechanisms to keep us from hurting. If I see someone early in the process, I'm doing grief counseling. If I see someone years later, it's grief therapy. It's very different. Because between the time of death and the time you come to my door, you're most likely engaged in mourning avoiding behaviors. Then we could be looking at substance issues, relationship issues, financial issues, interpersonal issues. Any questions? Comments? Does anyone want to take a stretch break? I'm going to get into the holidays now. Anybody want to take a stretch break?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay, thank you. Thank you for speaking up. Okay, 5-minute stretch break. Hi. I'm just going to remind you, you're at a grief seminar. There should be no laughing, no talking, no smiles. Right, Rick? Okay. When you come out to anything of a group format, it reminds your heart that you're not alone. Your head knows you're not alone, but it feels like you're all alone. So these types of gatherings are important to remind ourselves that we're not walking this journey on our own. So any questions or comments before we get into the holidays specifically? Okay, so why do the holidays hurt? Well, they hurt because of the Hallmark image, right? We have this image of what it should be like and what it has been like. So I wonder if you can maybe park that image for this year, for this season. Maybe you learn that you're going to write your own script. You're not going to submit to societal expectations. Don't expect yourself to stop the pain. It's more courageous to feel the pain. And please don't engage in any kind of mourning avoiding behavior because it hurts too much. Because it'll hurt more. So, your choice then is how are you going to handle the holidays? Now, if you've got children at home, yeah, there has to be some sort of normalcy. I agree. Because we still have to live in this world. So you're really straddling two worlds, even if you don't have young children. You're living in your grief world temporarily, and you're living in the real world. But how can we keep things normal? Because even if you put up a tree, and you put presents on the tree that came from Santa, you're still grieving. So are you going to ignore your pain? Are you going to diminish it? Are you going to repress it? Are you going to distract yourself from it? Or are you going to skip Christmas or holidays altogether? Is anyone going away for the holidays? Is that intentional? I got your number.
We got yours.
The only thing when we do it intentionally to avoid the pain, next year will be the first. The other thing is, and this is not related to avoiding, it's more related to the first and second holiday season. If your loved one died recently, you might be sleepwalking through this holiday season, and next will feel like the first. And be okay with that. Be all right with that. Do you understand what I'm saying? It'll be like you're numb. You know, but you don't know. And then you'll come out of the numbness, and you'll start feeling the pain, and next year it'll be. So don't be alarmed by that. That's normal. But if you intentionally choose to leave, not to do anything that's remotely related to your normal life, you will have to deal with it next year unless you intend to keep running. Or are you going to be courageous enough and participate in whatever activities you are emotionally and physically able to tolerate? And that's where the self-care comes in. That's where you have to make space for your grief. And only you can do it, because society is going to keep expecting certain things from you. It's your job to look after yourself during this upcoming holiday season. So pain is necessary. Pain is part of the package, but suffering is optional. And what we mean by that is, when we choose to fight the pain and not acknowledge it and deal with it, it becomes suffering. So we'd like grief to work one way, but it really doesn't work that way. So the more you try to untangle grief, the more it's going to be tangled. Grief comes and goes, and I by no means have it figured out. It's a no-show when I'm expecting it, but it shows up in places and on days I never saw it coming. Sometimes it's brief, and other times it lingers for longer than I would like. But one thing I know is that there's no way to avoid it or pretend it isn't there. It's not the grief I want to avoid, it's the pain that it causes. Trying to avoid the sadness and loneliness only prolongs the grieving process. So I lean into it and get through it. That's what takes courage. It's not about putting on the mask to pretend you're fine. And it's not your job to make other people comfortable. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Holocaust, says, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. So as you can see, all through this process, we're acknowledging there's going to be pain. But I don't want you to fear it, because we're really resilient. We have this built-in capacity to tolerate it. So, ways to cope. These are things I have gleaned over the years that I've worked with clients. Set your intention. You're going to get through the holidays, however imperfectly. It's not going to be a Hallmark experience this year. Give yourself some grace. Expect that there will be a multitude of feelings, including the pain. Don't go in there thinking it's going to be horrible. You might be surprised. Don't play those old tapes. It's going to be horrible. I won't get through it. You have to be tolerant of your physical limitation. The holidays at the best of times are difficult. They're stressful. I was at the mall last Saturday, which I shouldn't have been, and I was overwhelmed. I mean, we're just in mid-November, but I mean, that's why we do this holiday presentation at this time. So be aware of your physical tolerance levels, because grief is stress. Stress affects us physically. You're not operating the way you usually do right now. Let go of perfectionism and try to be flexible in anything you do this year. So for this year, be okay with it not being the way it was before. Just for this year. Talk about with family and friends what you want, what you'd like to see happen. You don't want any miscommunication. Many years ago, I had a mother who had lost her husband and son in a bus accident. It was a hockey team, a young hockey team. And she had a surviving child, a daughter. And unfortunately, we didn't talk about this before the holidays. After the holidays, she told me she would have normally bought one of those advent calendars for her children, especially for her son, and she desperately wanted to do that in memory of him. But she thought it would trigger her daughter. And I said, well, you could buy it, but you could keep it in your room, you could keep it in another room where, unfortunately, she didn't do it, she didn't tell her daughter. And after the holidays, she found out her daughter wanted to do the same thing, but they didn't talk about it. They didn't talk about what they needed. And so they both missed out on a wonderful opportunity to memorialize the young lad. So talk about your wishes. Maybe you can look at traditions and reimagine them. How can we do it differently? Please be humble enough to accept support. You don't have to cook the turkey like you've always done. If someone offers it, it may not be up to your standards, but if someone offers it, Be humble enough to say, okay. So while we don't want you to isolate this holiday season, you also need time during the season for solitude, because grief is an inner journey. So even if you're in a group and you need to take some time, you need to take a grief break, please allow yourself to do that. Let someone know, you know, I'm just going to go into another room. I'm going to do some deep breathing. I'm going to close my eyes for a moment. I'm going to go cry. Let go of all the myths, all the shoulds. You should do that. You should do this. What are you going to say to people when they say Merry Christmas? Happy holidays? Think ahead. What's within your control? Other people may not get what you're going through, and that's maybe when you have to tell them what you need. But it's up to you to do what you need to do. Say no to invitations if you're not up to it. But for every invitation you say no, I'd like you to at least accept one. But it doesn't mean you have to go for the whole event either. Remember, this is a strange season. This is a strange time. It doesn't have to be done the way it's always been done. Attend to your spirit. Remember what the reason is. Honor that. Who's going to carry out your loved one's tasks if they played a large role in the holiday planning? Who's going to fill the empty chair? And have a plan B. Have an option B. Have an exit strategy. Have a few exit strategies. Take your own vehicle. Find your own way to events so that if you're tired, you reached your tolerance, your levels, you've reached your ceiling, you leave. If you still go to the mall and shop in person, shop on days that are not as busy. Go during times that are less busy. If you have children, include them in the planning. If a grandparent died, if their sibling died, if they're old enough, ask them what they'd like to do. They're part of the family system as well. But also remember that children are very present moment living. So they're not always burdened with the grief like we are. They go in and out of the grief process. So be understanding of that. What's important this year? Maybe trim it down. Simplify. And maybe you give yourself permission to be okay also. That it's not being disloyal. Doesn't mean you don't love. It doesn't mean you've forgotten. It's just that we can't think of two thoughts at the same time. Simplify, simplify, simplify. Pare down. But don't ignore it. In some ways, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds meaning. So here's some ways where you might be able to honor your loved one. You could say a prayer and have a moment of silence before the holiday meal. Whatever is part of your tradition. The thing is to address it. You're not going to make people sad. They are sad. They just might be masking it. So say their names. Acknowledge their absence. And then move through it. Share a favorite story. The funnier the better. You could create a holiday album, scrapbook, online tribute. Any meaningful traditions that your loved one loved. Talk to your family about it. I know the first year my mom died, she was famous for a lot of things, but mostly her green bean casserole, because it was handed down from her grandmother. And well, she did such a good job, I never bothered to learn. So I told my dad that he had to make it. And so he made it. And now we make sure that we make it. Not perfectly, but that's one link to mom, the green bean casserole. So what is something you can incorporate? So they're not here physically present, but how are we going to remember them? Maybe you want to start collecting special ornaments. Or maybe you want to have a special tree, another tree. I've had families who have lit candles before the meal, displayed a photograph, had the candle lit during the meal. Hang their stocking and fill it with love letters. The reason I got into bereavement was 27 years ago, I lost my first child. And she was due in November, she was due in this month. And so she was going to be our Christmas baby. And that was devastating, as you can imagine. So I remember making a wreath for her grave. And I dosed myself with that pain. I did it at times, and when I got overwhelmed, I backed off, and then I did it at times, and I backed off until I got it done. I forced myself, but I did it with love, to go out and buy a gift for a newborn baby, and I donated it in her memory. And then my mom and dad said, we want to hang a stocking for her, because she should be here. So at that time, they had 2 other grandchildren. And they bought a special stocking and they hung it for Hannah. Was it painful? Yeah. Yeah. But was it meaningful? Yeah. Because we talked about it. We talked about it. And that was very meaningful for me because they were still thinking about her. So whatever your family, whatever feels comfortable to you, maybe you want to reach out to somebody that you haven't been in contact with. Do that in memory of your loved one. I've had clients donate their time in memory. Maybe you continue something that they love doing. You leave something off your list that you would have normally done, and you take this up, and you do that in memory of them. Maybe you want to adopt a family. Sometimes when we step outside of our pain, it becomes a little bit more meaningful. Because there will always be somebody who's hurting a little bit more than us. Well, there's my green bean salad, casserole. Maybe you want to start a special tradition. What is the true meaning of the season? What is the reason we all get together? If faith is part of your life, so instead of focusing on the triggers, the things that are going to bring pain, because there will be, we've said that. Maybe you focus on the glimmers. The glimmers are those moments when we can smile and we can be grateful. that we had them in our lives, that we have people that we're connected to. What are the gifts they brought into your life? How do they shape you into the person you are today? Make sure you set the intention. Make the decision to create a space for hope, for the possibility of peace, for relief, for gratitude, and yes, even a piece of joy, a bit of joy. Make sure you keep that door open, even the tiniest bit. It does not have to be all or nothing. One feeling can sit right beside another feeling. You can create space for hope. Tom Zuba wrote a book called Permission to Mourn, A New Way to Do Grief, and this was after his 18-month-old firstborn child died of cancer. 9 years later, his wife died of cancer. And 6 years later, his 13-year-old son died. And he says in his book, I was meant to survive to write this book for others. He's given it meaning. Now, I don't want you to falsely accept, the silver lining. That everything has a silver lining, everything happens for a reason. But if you can work your way to finding a place where you can find meaning in this loss in some way so that you don't carry bitterness and hurt in your heart, you will live a better life. So some take-home messages before we end. Grief process is normal, natural, and necessary. So don't try to fight it. You've got to feel it to get through it. They're going to hurt. Adjust your expectations. They are. But you can also find those glimmers as well. Look for those glimmers. Simplify, simplify, simplify for this year. Practice gratitude. Consciously practice gratitude. It could be as simple as if I have a roof over my head. I have a bed. That does wonders. Like neurobiologically, it does wonders. For the brain, for the heart, for the soul. Set your intention to get through this, however difficult. And I'm going to end with this. Grieving is a journey that teaches us how to love in a new way now that our loved one is no longer with us. Consciously remembering those who have died is the key that opens the heart, that allows us to love them in new ways. I wish you all a very peaceful holiday season. Please take care of yourselves, and remember it's one day. It's one day. You miss them every day. Okay? It's one day. And you can get through it. Thank you for coming out tonight. Safe drive to wherever you're going. Good night.